Today I want to take a look at G-flux. What is it and how could it help you improve your health while losing weight? Let's talk about it. I'll see you inside. So in today's podcast, I'm going to talk to you about why it might be a better idea to actually increase your activity instead of decreasing your food intake if you're trying to lose weight. And this is referred to as G-flux, and it's simply just the amount you eat and the amount you burn every day. For example, if you eat 1,000 calories and burn 1,000 calories, you have a lower G-flux than someone who eats 2,000 calories and burns 2,000 calories. And I understand that there's far more to weight loss and body composition than just calories, but this is assuming that you're eating adequate micronutrients and macronutrients. So if you don't already have that dialed in, I recommend you start there before you look at your G-flux. But I'm going to give everyone who's listening to this podcast the benefit of the doubt that you already have this stuff dialed in, and you're simply looking at G-flux to improve your health even more. So what would be the benefit of simply having a higher metabolism and eating more during a dieting phase, or even not during a dieting phase? What are the benefits in general of having a higher metabolism and eating more food? Before we get into that, I will actually note the downsides of this. So if we look at someone like a professional bodybuilder, they have an extremely high metabolism simply because of how much muscle mass they carry. And this is, in general, some of them may actually have a lower metabolism because of all the dieting they have gone through. They actually have a lower thyroid production. And having a low thyroid will decrease your metabolic rate and decrease the amount of calories you burn every day, specifically the amount of calories you utilize at rest. However, most bodybuilders, especially when they're trying to put on muscle and get larger, have an extremely high metabolic rate. And there's a few factors in this. One simply just being that they are carrying around more body weight on a daily basis, meaning that every single movement they make requires more energy than it would if they were 100 pounds lighter. But another important factor is actually a higher protein turnover. So if you built a bunch of muscle and then didn't eat any protein and didn't do any sort of weight training, and the reason is because if you don't give your muscles any sort of stimulus or any sort of reason to grow, your muscle will actually slowly catabolize, meaning get smaller, throughout the entire day. And this is the reason it's promoted to eat protein multiple times a day, every single day. So in an entirely fasted state, like when you wake up in the morning, you will actually be in a catabolic state, meaning you will be breaking down muscle. And when we eat protein, we increase what is called protein synthesis. And this is just the creation of new proteins that are used for muscle mass. And if you don't ever weight train, the amount of protein synthesis is not enough to counterbalance the amount of protein breakdown. Which is why eating more protein won't simply make you larger. You need the stimulus of weight training, because we can only stimulate so much protein synthesis at one time. And what weight training does is it actually increases the amount of protein synthesis that your body will go through. For example, let's say if you didn't do any sort of weight training, throughout the entire day you lose about 100 grams of muscle, and through repeatedly eating protein, you may increase your protein synthesis enough during the day where you also put on 100 grams of muscle. What weight training seems to do is simply increase the amount of protein synthesis we get and decrease the amount of protein breakdown. So even eating the same amount of protein, if you have done some sort of weight training exercise during that day, then in the 24 to 48 hours after the workout, you may actually only break down about 80 grams and you will build up about 120 grams. And now obviously these numbers are completely made up, but it shows you that what exercise does is decreases protein breakdown and increases protein accretion. And now you'd also have to factor in any sort of protein breakdown from the exercise, so this is a much more complex topic. But I'm just using this as an example to show you that at rest, we do actually break down muscle if there's no stimulus. And if we're not eating protein, then there's no building blocks to build the muscle, even if there is a stimulus. And what's important is that the more muscle mass you carry, the more protein breakdown you'll have at rest, and the more of these building blocks you'll require. So when you have an extremely high muscle mass, you'll have an increased metabolism, but you'll also have an increased baseline need for amino acids. And if I ever say amino acids and you get confused, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Just like how bricks can build a house, amino acids can build a protein. So one of the downsides of having an extremely high metabolism is you certainly will have to eat more food, and sometimes this can actually cause digestive distress. And now if you have a higher metabolic rate because you have higher thyroid, this may actually help to improve your digestion. However, at some point, you're simply just going to have to eat so much food, you are more likely to run into food allergies and just a more difficult time digesting all of it. And sometimes you may have to eat so frequently that by the time you're eating the next meal, the last meal is still digesting. And the other problem with having an extremely high metabolic rate is that it becomes extremely easy to get low on blood glucose. The more energy you use, the more that you'll need, and every once in a while you may not eat enough. So you'll begin to start using your blood glucose, and if this goes down too much, you'll resort to what's called gluconeogenesis. And this is actually using glycerol, which comes from body fat, amino acids, which again come from protein, and lactate, which is actually a byproduct of using glucose for energy, typically during exercise. Meaning the more specifically high intensity exercise we do, the more lactate we will likely create. And you can really think of it as that the more an exercise burns, the more lactate we're producing. So something that really stinks, like high intensity intervals or sets of 20 to 30 for some sort of hypertrophy workout, will probably produce a lot more lactate than just a walk or a very, very low intensity cycling session. Similarly, a all-out set of maybe 1 to 2, doing something like a powerlifting movement or a deadlift, doesn't really burn. This is because it relies on a different system of energy production and typically will not make very much lactate. But if you remember, I said that we use amino acids for this process. So if you have an extremely high metabolism and you're not eating enough, you are at greater risk of needing to use gluconeogenesis to keep your blood glucose stable. So all else being equal, you're at a greater risk of having to use amino acids for this process instead of for muscle. And if you have an extremely high metabolic rate and you go through periods of fasting, you're probably going to be much more likely to begin breaking down even more muscle to free up more amino acids for gluconeogenesis. So really one of the only issues with having too high of a G-flux is not eating enough. If you simply can't supply the body with enough nutrients to keep yourself from catabolizing muscle tissue, then G-flux could actually become detrimental in terms of your muscle mass. But having too low of a G-flux would also be pretty bad, so we would really want to try and be in the middle or on the higher end, given that we're eating enough. So what would be the benefits of having a higher G-flux? So if we actually go back to this gluconeogenesis process, this one becomes very interesting. If you remember this gluconeogenesis process, glycerol is also one of the fuels we can use. And glycerol is part of both dietary and body fat. And having a higher metabolism means that throughout the entire day, you will use more triglycerides for energy, which means you'll have more free glycerol available to use for gluconeogenesis instead of amino acids. For example, if your calorie expenditure during the day is only 1,000 calories, you may only use 100 grams worth of triglycerides a day, meaning you'll only get the amount of glycerol molecules contained in that 100 grams. But if your calorie expenditure is 2,000 calories, maybe you use 200 grams of triglycerides, and you get the amount of glycerol molecules available in 200 grams rather than 100. Simply the higher your caloric expenditure, the more of these free glycerol molecules you'll have to use for gluconeogenesis. Which is great because even though we have a higher metabolic expenditure, our blood glucose requirements is the same as someone with a lower metabolic expenditure. Additionally, if we're doing some sort of exercise to increase our metabolic expenditure, we'll likely produce more lactate. So in the end, we'll actually have more lactate molecules around as well. So both of these molecules can be used instead of amino acids for gluconeogenesis, meaning we'll have more amino acids available to increase our muscle mass. And I think this could be especially favorable for someone on a ketogenic or low-carb diet. because the only reason that they have any sort of glucose requirement is because they need glucose for the brain. But for the most part, no matter what the metabolic expenditure of your body is, because you're doing exercise, the amount of energy your brain needs will typically stay the same. So someone on a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet can increase their low intensity training almost as much as they want. Might actually be better off increasing the amount of low intensity training they're doing, like walking or light cycling, because these exercises actually can use fat instead of glucose as a fuel source. So it's almost like through the process of burning fat, they're creating more energy for gluconeogenesis if they need it. And this doesn't just apply to someone on a low carbohydrate diet. For almost anyone, they will use triglycerides either eaten or stored in their body fat for things like walking and just daily physical activities. And the more of these activities you do, the more glycerol you'll have available. So this is simply just a protective measure to try and reduce the amount of amino acids that we use for gluconeogenesis. And even if muscles aren't your main priority, amino acids are used for everything, including the repair of organs, skin, the production of neurotransmitters and hormones. Think about really anything in your body that has structure that isn't body fat or glycogen, which is just the small reserve of glucose we have. All of this is going to be built out of protein, meaning it's going to be built out of amino acids. Alright, now the next thing about having a higher G-flux is simply being able to fit more micronutrient-dense foods into your caloric intake. I look at it this way. The more we can eat, the more opportunity we have to nourish our body. And this one is pretty self-explanatory. Let's say our budget, so to speak, for breakfast is 500 calories. Maybe we choose to eat eggs, but in this case, we can only get the micronutrients available from 7 eggs. But if our budget is increased to 700 calories, then we can get all the micronutrients available in 10 eggs. Or we can eat 7 eggs and add in an additional food with even more micronutrients like berries. It's just like spending money. The more of a budget you have, the more things you can buy. And now the next thing that I think is important is simply just satiety. And while we did discuss maybe some of the adverse things that happen if you simply just have to eat an exorbitant amount of food that you simply can't digest enough of it, but if our goal is weight loss, we may actually have to face hunger every once in a while, and just having a higher volume of food can help fill us up a little bit more. And the other thing is, if we have more calories to use, we won't typically spend these calories on things that are very low in nutrients because they're very high in volume. So when people typically have to reduce the amount of food that they're eating, they may choose to have extremely large salads, and these things have a very high water content, but they really don't have much nutrition in them. Or they may choose to use a lot of artificial sweeteners that technically don't have a caloric count. And they use these things to make it feel like they're eating more, even though technically they're not eating more calories. In the grand scheme of things, they're typically just eating more water. But some of these foods can have pretty negative ramifications on our gut and our digestion. Sometimes the reason that these foods don't have calories is because we can't break them down, which means sometimes they can be left undigested floating down our intestinal tract, which has the potential both to kind of cause irritation on its way down and to make it to areas where there are bacteria that can actually digest and ferment these undigested food particles. And as a result, we may actually begin to get bloating and gas. So the more calories that we can eat, the less we'll have to actually rely on these foods, and the more we can choose foods that are easier to digest. Typically, foods that are easier to digest are simply just less voluminous. However, a lot of these are packed with nutrients that can actually help to decrease our hunger. You see, most of the foods that are extremely high volume but low in calories don't necessarily work by helping to promote the production of hormones that make us feel satiated, but instead, when we expand and stretch the stomach, it actually causes us to just stop producing a hunger hormone called ghrelin for a very short period of time. But once all this water is absorbed and our stomach goes back to its normal size, we will begin producing this hunger hormone again. And this is why just drinking a lot of water may make you feel full for maybe 10 to 20 minutes, but very soon after, your body will realize that it doesn't actually have any of the nutrients, and your hunger will increase again. But choosing foods that are very nutrient dense, like steak, eggs, and maybe potatoes, may not have as much volume, but once they digest, they will increase the production of hormones that suppress our appetite. And if we have the, for lack of a better word, caloric budget to spend on lower volume but higher calorie foods, we're likely going to feel more satiated at the end of the day. With that being said, this does not mean things like sodas, because these do not have the same appetite suppressive effects. What I mean is switching out things like egg whites for whole eggs, maybe switching out very large salads for potatoes, and switching out things like white meat and white fish for steak and salmon. Or if you really want some micronutrients, putting in some organ meats, sardines, and oysters. So that being said, this is simply just the benefits of eating more, but what are the benefits of doing more activity on a daily basis? Well, first off, one of the things that will actually promote G-flux, as I said, is having an increased muscle mass, because you will simply burn more calories at rest. But another benefit of having an increased muscle mass is you have what's referred to as a metabolic sink. What I mean is that muscles can actually store glucose, triglycerides, and amino acids. And the larger our muscles are, the more we'll be able to store in the muscle, which means we have a greater capacity before we spill over and begin storing excess nutrients as body fat. If you think of it like filling up a bucket, we simply just have a larger bucket to fill up and can put in more water before it begins to overflow. And doing more activity on a daily basis will likely increase the amount of the positive adaptations we can get from exercise. So more activity will mean more nutrient delivery to the muscle tissue and around the entire body, because we have more blood flow. And more blood flow also means better oxygen delivery and better metabolite clearance. What I mean is that as a byproduct of normal everyday metabolism, some of the cells will actually accumulate molecules that kind of just sit there and reduce the functioning of the cell. For example, during exercise, we may produce a little extra hydrogen. But the more blood flow we have, the better we will be at actually removing these waste products from the muscles and recycling them or excreting them through the liver. And simply, the more active we are throughout the entire day, the more blood will be flowing around our entire body. One of the dangers of sitting all day is that blood may actually just begin to pool in your legs, and you'll have reduced blood circulation. So simply just taking more steps throughout the day, more often, more frequently, and just more in general, will decrease the likelihood that your blood will kind of stay stagnant. And some of the other benefits of exercise itself is actually to increase your ability to fight inflammation just throughout the entire day. So just as a consequence of using more energy, exercise will acutely increase inflammation. But the way that we actually adapt to exercise is by increasing our defense systems to fight this off. So for the entire rest of the day, we have an increased defense towards just the day-to-day inflammatory processes. And the next time we exercise, we'll be better able to fight off and combat inflammation that's produced during exercise. So in essence, exercise itself makes us better at fighting off inflammation. And the only problem is if you get into the territory of overtraining, which will typically only occur if you're doing something like an Ironman triathlon, where you're producing so much inflammation that at the end of the day you're still at a net negative. But for most people, just increasing your daily activities, not daily high intensity activities, but just walking more, fidgeting more, standing more, none of these things will increase inflammation all that much. And as long as you don't do too much, once again, like an Ironman triathlon, typically exercise will help you decrease stiffness and increase your mobility. Okay, I hope I've convinced you about G-flux, but how do you actually go about implementing this in your daily life? And I actually wrote down a few things here that I'll just give to you. So the first is pretty easy. It's just taking more steps throughout the day. And you can also just stand more instead of sitting. And some ideas for this would be to get a stand-up desk or take phone calls on a walk. Another thing you could do is actually do small micro workouts during the day. Like every once in a while, just take 10 seconds and do 5 squats, or take a very short break and do 10 jumping jacks and then sit back down, or go back to standing. And maybe instead of watching TV with the family, maybe go out on an adventure and enjoy nature. Another idea would be instead of ordering your food, cook dinner at home and go through the entire process of preparing dinner. And if you have pets, instead of just leaving your pets outside all alone, go play with them. Again, I mentioned that increasing muscle mass will increase your metabolic expenditure. And now another interesting thing would be potentially trying cold exposure. And without getting into too much of the mechanism, cold exposure can actually increase the metabolic expenditure of your fat cells. So while it doesn't directly burn off fat, it can actually increase the amount of calories that you burn at rest, which could indirectly help with fat loss. And the last thing I'll mention is actually increasing your intake of all of the nutrients that support your thyroid health. Specifically, I'd recommend iodine, selenium, and zinc. Simply, the higher your thyroid is, the higher your resting metabolic expenditure will be in your daily metabolism. So trying to improve it in as many ways as possible, hopefully as many natural ways as possible, could definitely be advantageous to increase your metabolic expenditure. And it does actually appear that thyroid hormone itself can help increase muscle mass accretion given that you're eating enough. While it does increase metabolism, it will also increase protein synthesis. And with that being said, the last thing I will say is that eating all of the micronutrients in general, so trying to diversify your micronutrient intake as much as possible, because all of these micronutrients are required to actually support all of these metabolic processes. Which is why something like a B12 deficiency or another B vitamin can make you feel extremely tired and lower your metabolic rate. And this is fairly simple to try and get in more micronutrients. I suggest bivalves like oysters, trying to increase your intake of organ meats, choosing more nutrient-dense foods like eggs and steak instead of chicken and egg whites, and trying to get as much color in your diet from whole foods as possible, like eating the entire rainbow of fruits and vegetables, and even colorful things like salmon. For the most part, as long as it's not artificially dyed, the darker and more rich the color of a food, like the more blue a blueberry is or the more red a raspberry is, the more micronutrients and antioxidants it will have inside. And as many people may know, one of the best ways to increase your metabolism is simply to just slowly and progressively eat more food. Sometimes we will unconsciously decrease our metabolic expenditure simply because we're not eating enough. And when we begin to eat more food, we'll actually unconsciously do more fidgeting and do more movement throughout the day. So at the end of the day, we technically do eat more, but we also burn more unconsciously, and we lose the same amount of weight, but we are eating more food. So I certainly would suggest, instead of just immediately decreasing your caloric intake, just trying to increase your metabolic expenditure. And maybe if you're at a phase where you're at a very low caloric intake and your weight loss is kind of stalled, you could try increasing your caloric intake for a period of time, which may increase your energy and unconsciously increase your energy expenditure. But I actually want to do a whole entire podcast on this because it's referred to as reverse dieting or diet breaks, and it certainly could be a great tool to increase your G-flux and help get you past any sort of weight loss plateaus. With that being said, it's time for math class. So I want to say thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day, and I hope to see you next episode.